Hi, Dr. Alex here, and welcome to installing an NVMe SSD in a T430 ThinkPad again, which, as the title implies, is a follow-up to the last video where I installed an NVMe SSD in a T430 ThinkPad. But this time I'm doing a bit more testing and making sure I really can do it by repeating the process, both in the T430 and actually using some other ThinkPads I have available. There are lots of photos and screenshots in this process which are going to be plastered all over this video, quite a bit like the last video really. And there will be some more rigorous speed testing done towards the end of this video, which, spoilers, does show the NVMe drive is faster than the mSATA/SATA drives, but there's a bit of a surprise in the results, but I don't want to spoil all the surprises just now, so you'll have to wait till the end for that. Now, one of the first things I noticed, which raised suspicion in my head about how to change the grub, for example, when this thing's booting up. By the way, this is all done under Ubuntu, this is all done under Linux Mint 18, so if you're using another operating system, for example Windows, this might not be relevant, but hopefully there's some method of doing it under other operating systems. But from the Ubuntu Mint perspective, I thought I could change the grub just by changing the folders that are under the grub-d folder, changing the names of those folders, but then I noticed that both installs had identical names. There was nothing specifically naming the NVMe drive install in either of them, and so that immediately raised alarm bells that this can't be a way of doing it. So it turned out it wasn't. But now I'll go through all the tests I did do and the various other installs I did to make sure I could really do this twice. The first thing I did was take the NVMe drive out of the T430 to make sure it could still boot into the mSATA drive it had installed already, which it did perfectly fine. The grub menu still came up and it still showed that the NVMe drive's Mint install was there as an available option to try and boot into, even though the drive wasn't actually there, which is a bit weird. And obviously once it had booted up and opened up its home folder in the Mint GUI, obviously the NVMe drive wasn't there because it had been physically removed. The next thing I did, of course, was reinsert the NVMe drive back into the Express Card slot and checked everything was still working. On reboot, everything was as it was before. The grub menu came up and it showed the NVMe drive install of Mint 18 there as an OS to select, and it still ran fine if you selected it, with the slight error it threw up, which you can press enter and go past. It's a bit of a niggle, a problem, an annoyance, but actually no real fundamental problem in getting things to work. It's just a little bit of an annoyance. I have to press enter to go faster past that error. So as I say, changing the names of the files under the etc. default grub folder had no effect on changing the boot order, so I had to go down another way of playing with the grub boot order, which was by installing Grub Customizer. This was a very simple to use utility once installed, and once opened up I could see that both the mSATA install of Mint 18 and the NVMe drive install of Mint 18 were both in the list of options, and as I saw when I initially booted up, the NVMe one was below the mSATA original install. So I moved it up to the top. Other things I had to do to make sure it was actually going to work properly. Under the general settings, I made sure that it was going to show the grub as it booted up. I also lowered the timeout for the grub selection down to 1 second. I left it at that just so I could hastily press an arrow key to select a different one if I needed to in a rush. It means every test I've done for its boot times, I've had to delete a second from those times, but that's not exactly a big issue, and it makes it a safer way to play with the grub without never being able to install the other OS if I wanted to. While playing with the boot order, I also made sure that it was the NVMe one first, then none of the other options, but the mSATA's Mint 18 boot second, so that if it did fail to install the NVMe, it would then default to trying to install the mSATA one second and not try and do any of the advanced options for the NVMe drive, which wasn't actually there anymore or was having a problem. But I'd done enough to convince myself that there was no problems with this install and running it on the T430 as it was. Now, this is where I moved into tests where I was trying to see if I could install it without killing the operating system, which is how I got it onto the T430 in the first place, by installing it on the T430 while writing the NVMe's grub onto the mSATA's drive's grub and screwing up its grub and then having to reinstall grub. Lots of grub in that sentence. This worked, but I wanted to see if I could do it without having to kill an operating system's grub. So to that end, the next thing I did was move to my T420, which had a perfectly fine operating system, which had never had its grub killed by me, and see if I could get it to see the NVMe drive that I created. So upon putting the drive into the T420, booting up, grub was still not visible, and it didn't try to boot into it, it just went straight to the SATA drive that's already in the T420. Again, I installed Grub Customizer to make the next thing easier. I could see the NVMe drive using Grub Customizer, and so I shifted everything around, made its operating system the second one that was going to boot after the SATA drive, I think, or the other way around. Either way, made those two the top entries. And upon doing so, discovered that if I selected the NVMe drive from Grub as it was booting up, it booted up fine with no problems, except that one error it always throws up, which you can enter through very quickly. So I did it. I had an NVMe drive that I'd installed on another machine, now working on the T420, with no destruction of its existing operating system necessary to get it to work. Which is great, but I would like to know if I could create the install of the operating system on the NVMe drive without destroying any operating systems in the process and still have it work. And so I stuck with the T420. And to be extra safe, the first thing I did was remove the SATA drive it had, so there was no way that the install could write to anything on that drive. Then I inserted and booted the LiveBoot DVD for Mint 18, which weirdly can see the NVMe drive if it's the only thing in there, and allows me to install it in a standard way to that drive. But when you then reboot, its grub cannot see the NVMe drive, so it allows the install, and then it's still invisible to the computer. So in order to get it to work, put the SATA drive back in, reboot into the SATA drive's install of Mint 18. If you make the grub visible, you can see the NVMe drive's install on the now 2 terabyte NVMe drive that I've used. By the way, you can see that that one sticks out the side because it's too long for the Express Card bay that's there, but it was great for testing, and it's not that bad having a little bit sticking out. Makes it easy to pop in and out anyway. The one thing I was worried about, though it was now visible in Grub, was that somehow that Grub entry had been created by me sticking in the smaller 256GB NVMe SSD that I'd used before into the T420, and that somehow it's only ever going to be creating an entry if I'd done some weird install with the killing the operating system, which is how I made that one on the T430 originally. By the way, the first time I tried to use the NVMe drive using that entry, which I was suspicious had been created using the T430's drive, it did fail the first time. So I booted into SATA and then reopened Grub Customizer again. Didn't change anything, but resaved it with the mSATA and NVMe drives listings in the grub, as it should be. And the second time I rebooted, it did work. So, don't know why, but it did work on the T420 without me having to do anything after I went to Grub Customizer twice and saved the configuration twice. Then it was fine. But as I suggested, I still was a bit worried that I couldn't create an install without having that weird NVMe drive I created on the killing the T430's original OS install I did. So I wanted a completely clean install of an NVMe drive on like the 2 terabyte one I made, but then I wanted to see if it could be made to work on a completely new ThinkPad. And to that end, I went to the T530, which had never seen the old 256GB NVMe drive install, and I tried the 2 terabyte one in that. The T530, when already booted into its mSATA drive version of the Mint 18 OS, could see the 2 terabyte NVMe drive as soon as it was inserted, so great, reading it. When I rebooted the T530 with no alterations, there's no grub menu because I hadn't made it visible, and it went straight into the mSATA version of the OS, which is exactly what you'd expect, so it ignored the NVMe drive entirely. Again, installed Grub Customizer for speed. The first time I ran it, it obviously had the NVMe drive visible in the list of potential things for Grub. I changed the order again to put the NVMe install near the top. I also checked show the Grub menu and also reduced the time to 1 second. Then after a reboot, of course, save it first, then rebooted, and the NVMe drive was in the Grub shown. It got to the error that you'd expect every time it seems to go through an NVMe drive. It has a little error throw up, but again, pressing enter gets through that in a split second. And it was in, done. The T530 could see the Linux Mint 18 install on the 2 terabyte NVMe drive, and it was there in Grub, and it worked. So that was a computer that never had its OS destroyed in making the NVMe bootable Linux Mint 18 install, and the install itself was created without destroying any OSs on the T420 I had. So I'm pretty convinced that you can make an NVMe drive visible on old classic ThinkPads. We've had it visible on the T420, the T430, and the T530, so that's a pretty good starting list for a start. One thing I would say, if you do this, or if I do this ever again, not that I really need to right now, but if I do, I'd probably, if I was doing it from scratch on an old classic ThinkPad, get a small mSATA drive, like a 256GB mSATA drive, to put an initial OS install of, say, Mint 18 on that, and I'd buy a larger NVMe drive to stick in as the primary drive eventually. Probably a 1 terabyte if I didn't want it sticking out the side, unless I was going to pay like stupid money for a short 2 terabyte NVMe drive, and install the OS on the mSATA drive, then install the OS on the NVMe drive, for safety probably removing the mSATA drive in the process, and then after having both of them installed, use Grub Customizer to massage the Grub to whatever you want. You can, for example, put the NVMe drive as the first thing to install. You could put the timeout down to 1 second, or even 0 seconds if you're feeling daring, and you'd have a fast install from whatever machine you've got straight into the NVMe drive as its primary drive, even though essentially on paper the mSATA drive you've got in there is really acting as its primary drive because that's where the Grub's sitting, but for everything else it's using the NVMe drive. Last thing I did is I put the 2 terabyte NVMe drive into the T430 again, which you can see on screen probably at the moment, sticking out the side a little bit there. And to get it to work properly with the new NVMe drive, this is not its original 256GB NVMe drive it had, now the 2 terabyte one, I booted up into the mSATA install of Mint 18, ran Grub Customizer, and made sure that the Grub was as it needed to be with the NVMe one listed and in the right order, and checked it was going to... in fact, it already was in the right order, but I saved it anyway to make sure it really was going to pick it up. And as you'll see in a moment, it now runs fine with the 2 terabyte NVMe SSD in it in the Express Card slot. And now we're going to just do a little bit of testing with it running. Okay, first thing we can do is boot the thing up. It takes about 15 seconds. I've timed it a few times. Obviously removing the 1 second for that delay in the Grub that you have to have anyway. And I've done it repeatedly, so it comes out at 15 seconds when you take that second off when booting the NVMe drive, which is a bit quicker than the mSATA install. Also, there is a speed difference between when it's running on power versus running on battery. If you do it on battery, it's about 20 seconds to boot up, whereas if it's powered, it's 15. So there's already differences there, which might explain some of the results in previous videos. But anyway, for this one, I've got it plugged into the power, so it should take about 15 seconds to boot up. My arm will come into shot and you get to see it all over again. But here it goes, coming in now. Error point. I was a bit slow with my error point there. Boink, and we're there. We're at the login prompt. It should have been about 15 seconds. I imagine it would be around that. Now, I did various speed checks on the drive to show which one was faster. I'll show you them on screen, but I did them repeatedly and got averages for them. Let me just log in for a second. So the first official speed test I did was using an app called HD Palm, HDPARM, I think, which returns the cached reads to the drive and also the buffered reads to the drive. And we'll run it now so you can see it. So this time for the SATA drive, it's returned 11,520 for the cached reads, and it's returned 271 for the buffered reads. That's megabits per second. Having one run on its own isn't particularly instructive, but when I ran it 3 times before, it averaged 11,882 megabits per second on the cached and 271 on the buffered. The buffered one was very, very, very reliable and regular. Now let's see the NVMe drive results. Here it goes. Okay, so the cached results this time were 12,093 megabits per second, and the buffered one was 359 megabits per second. Now, this, as you can probably already see, means that the cached ones were basically the same on both drives, but the buffered ones showed an appreciable difference between the two. And this is true when I did the averaging. So for the averaging, I had 11,870 for the NVMe, and I had 11,882 for the SATA, basically the same. But the buffered one for the NVMe was 359 versus 271 for the SATA, which just on this test alone gives it a 33% increase in data throughput on the NVMe versus the SATA. Not perhaps as mind-blowing as you might expect, though. Given people often quote the NVMe drives being 2.5 or more times faster than SATA, that's not 2.5. That's 33% faster, or a third faster, as opposed to 150% or more faster. So not as much faster as you'd expect, but it was definitely still faster. And this lack, or this slightly lower increase in the speed, might well be down to limitations of the Express Card bus itself. Maybe its data throughput is just not fast enough to get the absolute maximum you can get from an NVMe drive. But nevertheless, it's still faster than the SATA and the SATA drives, presumably, since they're identical. I did do another test, though. I'll show the SATA's drive on this one, but because I'd need to log off to do the NVMe drive, I'm not going to bother with that one. I will put the results that I took screenshots of up on screen, though. I used Mint 18's inbuilt disks application, which you'll see here. You can select a disk and do benchmark partition, or benchmark drive, essentially what you're doing. Obviously, I can't do the NVMe one because it's booted onto that, but I can do the SATA drive install and do a benchmark on that, so you can see how fast that is, although I've already done it, but here's just so you can see what it looks like. Select benchmark partition. On the next screen, you have to select start benchmarking. After that, it gives you the settings for the benchmarking. You then have to press start benchmarking again on another button, which it then does once you've entered your password again. Then it does it. Now the results it's showing are slightly different from what I did the first time, but I'm going to use that because I've got that screenshot to hand. So the SATA managed read speeds of 280 megabits per second and write speeds of 260 megabits per second, whereas, and this I'll have to just flash up a screenshot for, the NVMe drive managed 403 megabits per second for its read speed and 360 megabits per second for its write speed. So Its read was 44% faster, the NVMe drive versus the mSATA, and its write was 38% faster, the NVMe drive versus the mSATA. Again, not the 150% plus that you might expect, but still measurable and significantly faster. So on balance, I say it is worth putting an NVMe drive in these. It will be quicker. But it obviously took a bit of work on my part to get it to work the first time. But now you've seen how I did it, hopefully it'll be a little bit easier for you. And really, that's all I need to do. I've shown you that it's possible to install an NVMe drive into a T430, or indeed pretty much any other classic ThinkPad that has an Express Card slot, and that you can install the operating system on the NVMe card without destroying the operating system you already had on there, perhaps on an mSATA or SATA drive, for example. And that by using Grub Customizer is probably the easiest way of doing it. You can play with the grub order to make sure the NVMe drive comes up first, and you can reduce the wait time for it to as low as you like. And there's one error which I've yet to figure out if you can auto skip it somehow. There may be a way of playing with grub in a more technical way that could skip that error, but otherwise get ready to press enter, because then you just go straight past that error and you're into your NVMe version of the install of your OS of choice, although in this case all the ones I've shown you are Ubuntu/Mint. But there you go. Classic ThinkPads will work with NVMe drives as their main booting drive. I don't see me doing any more videos on this subject anytime soon, because I've pretty much done all I can do with this. So I hope you found this useful. I hope you enjoyed it. And until the next video, whatever that may be, it might be something doctor related, you never know. I hope you will join me for that video. And until then, to all my listeners, subscribers and watchers, take care.
Masters, mistresses, the Doctor requires materials in order to maintain the TARDIS and ensure continued functionality. He similarly requires carbon-based comestibles to sustain his own biological functions and existence. Master would never say this, but he requires aid beyond that supplied by this unit in order to acquire these. To aid the Doctor in his various tasks and creations, this can be most effectively achieved via Patreon or Substack subscriptions, or through donations directly to PayPal. Or if you desire physical goods in return for your contributions, written accounts of my travels with the Doctor are also available on Amazon. Links are in the description below. Thank you, masters, mistresses.